The Lion's Folly. My lord, the Lannister men are being roused for battle, one of Eddard's guards announced from the tent opening. Very well, Hugo, I will not be long, Eddard replied, waiting for the guard to close the flap. Eddard Stark, seated in his Spartan tent, took a moment to absorb the news. The loyalty of his men, both those who had served his father and the eager new recruits seeking justice for their liege's family, was a source of strength for him. Their unwavering dedication was evident, and even his good father, Lord Hoster Tully, had taken notice. Lord Hoster was a polite man, but beneath his courteous facade lay a discerning nature. Genuine praise from him was rare, making his compliment on the Stark household guard particularly meaningful. Eddard's thoughts drifted to his wife, Catelyn. They had been married for less than a year. Though their union had been born of duty rather than love, and further complicated by his sense of guilt over marrying his brother's intended, he found himself growing increasingly fond of her. She was a vision, both strong and graceful, and he appreciated her more with each passing day. It was no fault of hers that she had been his brother's betrothed, and he had promised himself not to hold this over her. His genuine affection only deepened upon learning she was with child. He probably would not see the birth of their child, and could only hope this son or daughter would grow up knowing their father. The thought that House Stark now consisted only of him and Benjen gnawed at Eddard. If he were to die, it would leave his younger brother and the unborn child alone in this cruel world. He clung to the hope that Lyanna was alive somewhere, perhaps in Dorne, as Sir Barristan had hinted. The knight had mentioned that 3 of his Kingsguard brothers were with Ned's sister, suggesting that Lady Ashara, still in contact with her brother, might know more. The prospect of that conversation filled him with dread, but he would endure anything to bring his sister home. However, such thoughts were a luxury he couldn't afford now. The impending siege loomed large in his mind. He had fought at both the Stony Sept and the Trident, but never had he participated in a siege. While songs were made for battles, few bothered to do the same for sieges. This was because sieges were often very droll affairs, depending on the hastiness of the sides. Lord Tyrell had managed to drag out the Siege of Storm's End for over a year. Eddard could not imagine the glory-hungry Reach knights he had seen at Harrenhal being satisfied with that. It did not seem that Lord Mace was wont to change this, however, happily starving Robert's younger brothers and household. This siege, however, might be different if Lord Tywin and his brother Kevin were correct about their underhanded deal. An assault was, of course, the complete antithesis of a slow, starving siege. Eddard steeled himself, rising from his chair. It was no longer time for thought and brooding, it was a time for action. He had a duty to fulfill for his king, Robert, and then to his family. He picked up his sword belt, which had been leaning against the table leg. It had been wise of his father to leave ice at Winterfell. Eddard did not think he could wield it yet, and he was doubly thankful that the Targaryens had not been able to steal anything more from his family. He secured the belt around his waist, feeling the familiar weight of his sword and ensuring his dagger was secure on his other side. Taking a brief moment to ensure that nothing important was left behind in his modest tent, he walked toward the tent flap. The siege camp outside the walls of King's Landing was a miserable place. The city's stench regularly wafted into their camp, even from a distance. Ned wrinkled his nose as he stepped out of the tent. Eddard and his Northmen, who had arrived 3 days earlier, were camped on the flank of the main Lannister camp near the bay. Lord Tywin had offered Ned a tent next to his own large red pavilion, but Ned had turned it down, preferring to sleep among his men. He wanted to be close to them, both for their morale and for his own peace of mind. The recent duplicity of the Lannisters, pretending neutrality to gain entrance to King's Landing through deceit, had made Ned wary. If Tywin was willing to betray his friend and king, whom he had served as hand, then Ned would not trust him until he proved faithful to their cause. 2 other nobles were camped at the outskirts of the Lannister host in addition to Eddard and his Northmen. These were Sir Gregor Clegane, called the Mountain, a name he lived up to both in size and brutality, and Sir Amory Lorch, a pig-like knight with a high-pitched voice and cruel, beady eyes. The presence of these 2, supposedly defenders of the innocent, made Eddard doubt the entire institution of knighthood. It certainly didn't align with the lessons he had learned at the Eyrie from Lord John Arryn himself. The northern camp was bustling with activity. Soldiers sharpened swords, mended armor, and tended to the horses. Eddard had chosen riders for his quick journey to King's Landing after their scouts had heard word of the Lannister host on its way down the Gold Road. Northern cavalry was unlike the heavily armored knights of the Reach or the Vale. They were mostly made up of light cavalry hailing from the Rills and House Ryswell, adept at swift movements and guerrilla tactics. While there was cavalry from every major vassal of his, they numbered in the hundreds at most, often serving as personal guards for their lords. The great exception to this was the Manderley Knights. These knights, whether landed or hedge, were heavily armored, reflecting the Reachman heritage of House Manderley, which had influenced their military composition. "My lord," a voice called out, and Eddard turned to see Lord Howland Reed arriving at his side. Eddard had gained a deep appreciation for the Crannogman, who was as diligent and loyal as he was unassuming. The fact that Lyanna had considered Howland a friend only heightened Ned's respect for him. "Howland, leave your courtesies for the court. You are a dear friend of my sister," Ned responded. The smaller man nodded a little hesitantly. "Very well, Ned. I wanted to inform you that Lord Tywin and his lords are on the western side of camp." "Thank you, Howland. I will make my way there promptly," Eddard replied. "Could you gather our lords and follow? I fear that battle will be inevitable today regardless of whether Sir Christopher upholds his deal." "Of course, it will be done," Howland said, turning to carry out the task. Eddard watched him go for a moment before turning and making his way to his mount. A few Stark guardsmen, along with a close personal guard of noble sons who had joined him in battle at the Trident, were already gathered around his horse, mounted and ready. This noble guard consisted of Theo Wall of the Mountain Clans, Martin Castle, and Sir Mark Ryswell. Eddard swung his leg across the saddle and nodded to Theo Wall and Martin Castle, who were on his left flank. They returned the silent greeting as he clicked his tongue, prompting his horse to move. His proud banners flapped calmly in the morning breeze, the direwolf of House Stark glaring resolutely as they entered the Lannister camp. Grey, black, and white tents gave way to a vibrant array of red, gold, blue, and yellow as Eddard entered the heart of the Lannister camp. The Andals had always been more flamboyant with their colors, contrasting sharply with the North's more subdued and practical hues. Banners flew across the camp, displaying everything from the Golden Lion of Lannister to the Boar of House Crakehall and the Unicorn of House Brax. Why this Westerland house had chosen an animal only found on Skogas, Eddard could not fathom. He wasn't even aware that the Southerners knew of Skogas' existence in reality, never mind its unique animal. Dozens of other banners soon blended together as his mind wandered from the now mostly empty tents, their inhabitants already risen and engaged elsewhere. His focus was on one specific knight, who had risen higher than any lowborn knight since the Stark had last been involved in matters at King's Landing, excluding recent events. The rise of Sir Christopher Mudd, first as commander of the City Watch and then, mere moons later, as Hand of the King, had seemed absurd when Eddard first learned of it upon his arrival at the siege camp. However, he had no choice but to believe the claim when all he asked corroborated it. That the melee champion of that god's-forsaken tourney had risen so far, and then, according to the Lannisters, intended to betray the very infant king he served, was almost unbelievable. While Ned had never considered the Mud Knight a paragon of virtue and chivalry, he had at least thought him firm in his beliefs and the furthest from a craven of any sort. He had even grappled with Robert himself in a brief wrestling duel during that very melee. Yet, war reveals a man's true self, and in this case, the impossible odds faced by the young knight had brought out a side of Sir Christopher that Ned had not seen last they met. The Royalists' last army was still at Storm's End, according to the most recent war councils after the Trident. From what little Eddard had learned of the Tyrell lord there, it was possible that he would simply stay put, regardless of the capital's plight. Lord Tywin had countless scouts on the other side of the Blackwater Rush, ready to inform them of any Tyrell approach from the south. They were doubly fortunate that the royal fleet, the Targaryens' greatest asset now, would be foolish to attempt to pick up the Tyrrells in Shipbreaker Bay. The fates of Lord and Lady Baratheon were the last reminders of this, devastating as it had been to Eddard's friend. Eddard would not consider the war won, though. They were close, but they had suffered great losses at the Trident. Additionally, Lord Jon Arryn had returned to the Vale with a majority of his lords and men due to reports of unprecedented attacks by the mountain clans around the Gates of the Moon, Runestone, Redfort, and Strongsong. These reports had been delivered at war councils in the aftermath of the Trident. Robert, like Eddard himself, considered the Vale a second home, having not been spared from clashes with the mountain clans in their youth. This history meant that Lord Jon almost had to restrain Robert's desire to send men to crush the mountain clans immediately. The more experienced and wise Valarlord reminded Robert that the war was not yet won and that the clans were likely to disappear at the first signs of any large resistance, like the cowardly raiders they were. This was a great loss to the rebel host. While all agreed that Eddard's Northmen had prevented a collapse of the Loyalist forces that day, it was also widely recognized that the Knights of the Vale had been instrumental in winning the day at the Trident with their relentless charges and fierce fighting against the Targaryens. If they failed to take King's Landing this day, Eddard would endeavor for them to wait for the arrival of Robert and the rest of the rebel army. He missed the rest of his men still with Robert under the command of Lord Roose Bolton and Lord Wyman Manderley. While he trusted both men with command, he had reservations about their effectiveness in a fight for differing reasons. The Manderley Lord was obvious to all as no fighting soul, not to mention his large stomach. He had only headed his army as a show of continued loyalty toward House Stark in these dark times. This gesture was greatly appreciated by Eddard, who let Manderley handle logistics and the organization of his men. Lord Roose Bolton, meanwhile, had always been loyal and competent, never challenging him. However, Eddard greatly preferred a furious Great John Umber to the unfeeling grey eyes of Lord Roose. Bolton's silence in the company of their fellow countrymen was unnerving. Eddard knew he could not shun or disrespect one of his lords simply because he was unnerved by him. He found that giving the Bolton Lord more responsibilities in command was a good compromise, putting Lord Roose out of his sight while hopefully not disrespecting the Lord either. Unfortunately, the main force would take its time traveling down the King's Road, burdened with many prisoners and exhausted men, horses, and supplies after the decisive battle. Eddard wasn't blind to Lord Tywin's need for something to show Robert and reward him for his neutrality in this war either. Such flimsy loyalty, revealed only at the last possible moment, would not look good for anyone, least of all the previous hand of the Mad King. Eddard would play along with one attempt, considering the allure of an open gate into the city. The sooner King's Landing fell, the sooner he could attempt to find his sister and bring her back to Winterfell where she belonged. Starks were not meant for the south. Cregan Stark had known it in his time, and Eddard's own father and brother had fallen victim to its perils. His sister was lost almost as far south as one could go if Sir Barristan was to be believed. Oh, how he wished this deal would work. Stark, Eddard heard from his side, turning in his saddle toward the noise. Theo Wool was a towering warrior, cousin to Hugo Wool, the clan chief of House Wool. Though Theo neared the mountain in size, his demeanor couldn't have been more different. His voice was baritone and gruff, but he was one of the most faithful and loyal men Eddard knew. "We are here," Theo informed him bluntly. Eddard blinked, refocusing his gaze to see the red cloak of Lord Tywin at the end of a rough, trodden path of upturned mud. Surrounding Tywin were tens of lords and knights, the strength of the Westerland's nobility. "Right," Eddard replied, mentally chiding himself for his lapse in attention. He needed to stay sharp. He noticed Sir Mark Ryswell looking at him hesitantly as he glanced around at his guards. "Sir Mark, Theo, Martin, and 2 guards will follow me to Lord Tywin. The rest will wait here for the other lords," Eddard instructed, his gaze intent on his men as 2 guardsmen guided their horses forward to join him and his companions. The smaller force soon made their way forward, their horses stepping through the mud, stomping any grass further into the brown and black mixture. As his party navigated between the Westerland's knights and eventually minor lords, more and more of them parted, creating a path toward the imposing figure of Lord Tywin and his closest commanders. Among them were Lord Roland Crakehall, Lord Daemon Marbrand, and Sir Kevan Lannister. The towering presence of Sir Gregor Clegane and the hunched, yellow-cloaked form of Sir Harys Swift flanked them on either side. Lord Tywin turned his white courser as Eddard arrived within talking range. Lord Stark, well met, the Lannister nodded in greeting with cold courtesy. Sir Kevan, positioned on his brother's right hand, nodded silently as well. Both brothers were clad in high-quality armor, meticulously polished, with great woolen crimson cloaks draped over their shoulders. The only distinguishing feature between their apparel was the glinting rubies adorning Lord Tywin's pommel at his waist. Aside from the jewelry, Lord Tywin's bald head and bushy side whiskers set him apart from the younger, short-haired Sir Kevan. Additionally, Tywin's cold, pale green eyes contrasted with Kevan's more vibrant green eyes, which held a deeper color. Lords Crakehall and Marbrand observed Eddard's approach silently, offering no courtesy, while Sir Gregor and Sir Harys regarded them with open hostility and disdain, respectively. Eddard couldn't help but notice the piss-colored cloak worn by Sir Harys, and it seemed apt in his mind as he briefly glanced at the knight's attire. Among Tywin's council, he found it difficult to justify Sir Harys' presence. He didn't believe Tywin Lannister to be fond of small-minded lick-spittles, but perhaps it was a display of power in some fashion. Tywin was undoubtedly proud, and it might have pleased him to have lesser vassals groveling for favor at his side. He pushed aside those thoughts as he returned Lord Tywin's nod of greeting. "I thank you, Lord Lannister. I see you have roused your men," Eddard stated simply, his gaze finally shifting past Tywin to take in the formation of Lannister footmen arrayed between their small tents and the looming city walls. To the right, the glint of armor from hundreds of knights and thousands of cavalry caught his eye. Lord Tywin grunted. "The gate was opened a small time ago and fighting has been heard. Now we are only waiting for the last stipulation." Eddard looked past Tywin toward the city. Indeed, he could discern that the portcullis was raised, and he saw both a white and a red banner flying over the gatehouse. Though details were not visible from this distance, he knew it wasn't the black banner of House Targaryen. As Eddard heard mutterings around him, he noticed a horse carrying a slouched figure cloaked in grey emerging from the gate and slowly making its way toward them. The rider's identity was indiscernible from this distance, but the strongest suspect was obvious. It seemed Sir Christopher had fulfilled his part of the deal. Sir Kevan seemed to share Eddard's suspicion as he swiftly turned to one of the trumpeters standing ready. "Signal the cavalry to advance and send a rider to order the men to protect that rider," the Lannister knight commanded, directing the trumpeter and a runner respectively. As a series of blasts sounded from the trumpet, Eddard witnessed something more disconcerting. Two darker cloaked riders emerged from the tunnel in full gallop. The Lannister cavalry had just started moving when the riders swiftly approached the grey-cloaked man. Lord Tywin and he watched silently as they arrived on both flanks of Sir Jaime, and one figure reached over to take hold of the horse's reins. They were still half a mile from the Lannister cavalry when, after securing the reins, the riders swiftly wheeled around and headed back toward the city. This turn of events prompted shouts of dismay and outrage among the lords. Sir Harys' horse stepped forward a step with the man's chest inflating self-importantly. "I am sure my good son's riders will catch." Eddard saw Lord Tywin twitch, his hand gathering into a fist before interrupting his vassal. "I want a full assault on that gate by our foot." "You already have your orders," Tywin commanded, his voice strained. "Pull back the damned cavalry as well. They won't catch up before the gate." Immediately, the lords and commanders sprang into action. Trumpets blared and orders were barked as horses rushed past and down toward the foot. Below, the majority of the Lannister men began their march. Eddard noted a fifth of them left standing as a reserve, numbering around the same as the cavalry, making the assault force around 8,000 strong if he estimated correctly. Eddard guided his horse up to Lord Tywin's left side, joining Sir Harys, the Mountain, and Sir Kevan as the only nobles of note remaining. Sir Harris seemed a lot more demure now, and the fact that he was Sir Kevin's good father finally revealed why he was even there. Lord Tywin revealed little now. From their first meeting, Eddard had noticed that the Lannister lord never disclosed his thoughts without intention, except perhaps now. Even the Great Lion would feel something at the near return of his son, he supposed. Yet, now all emotions were once again hidden behind a calculating and cold mask. "It may still be a trap," Eddard eventually commented. There was something that had been bothering him about this whole situation. He hoped with all his heart that this plan would succeed, but he could not ignore the possibility of trickery. For a moment, Tywin seemed not to have heard him, given the man's lack of reaction. But after a few moments, the Lannister lord turned to him slowly. "It could be," Tywin agreed, though his eyes quickly shifted back to the thousands of men under the crimson banners of his house, advancing steadily toward the gatehouse. "My most elite men and lords will stand in reserve outside the walls," Tywin added. Eddard wondered if any assault would be successful without support from the more elite forces. Levies and other footmen were not the most reliable in any fight. "Well, either we commit, or we simply sacrifice those men in a bloody fight that they very well may not win," Eddard countered. He did not like the Lannisters' seeming indifference. Lord Tywin's face remained unchanged as he answered coldly, "Then they will soften the ground for our reserves to win. We have reinforcements in the form of both our King and Lord Arryn. You may lose 4/5 of your army if they are not reinforced." "I struggle to see how that is a favorable trade," Eddard replied, baffled by Lord Lannister's apparent apathy towards his own men. "Sir Christopher surely commands men who will fight, and these are city watchmen. Even if they outnumber us, they lack the equipment to match my troops in individual combat," Tywin declared decisively. Frowning, Eddard was interrupted by the approaching sound of riders. Turning, he saw his assembled lords arriving with a sizable cavalry behind them. With a final glance at Tywin, who remained unmoved, Eddard wheeled his horse to join his lords. "My lord, we are ready," Howland announced as he, Great John Umber, Lord Elise Hornwood, and Lord Rickard Karstark rode to meet him a few feet before the gathered cavalry. Great John Umber sat atop a great lumbering warhorse, both rider and steed clad in chainmail. The Umber heir's gigantic greatsword stuck out behind his back, the leather handle showing signs of extensive use. The sword was larger than even ice. If Eddard hadn't witnessed Great John overpower countless foes at the banks of the Trident only weeks ago, he would have struggled to believe such a weapon could be wielded at all. Great John, however, was no ordinary human, at least when he was fighting. The only reassurance Eddard had was the knowledge that Great John was under his banner. If there was one thing that matched Great John's size, it was his loyalty to his house since his father and brother's deaths. "Thank you, Howland," Eddard said, nodding gratefully to his sister's friend before addressing his lords. "The Lannister infantry is storming the open gate now. Lord Tywin plans to soften any resistance for further attacks if the initial assault fails." Even Great John looked uncomfortable with this tactic. The North and their lords fought alongside their men, sharing in both death and triumph. Eddard raised a hand, halting any burgeoning discussion. "It is Lord Lannister's prerogative, but may my ancestors strike me down if we simply sit behind." There was a loud cheer from his lords and some of the front row soldiers who heard his pledge. Still, Eddard knew it was prudent to let the battle develop a little. He was no green boy foolishly riding onto a spear, and he intended to act wisely. "Circumstances are such that we will wait for further orders. We all fight under the Stag banner now, and we cannot afford infighting. I will convene with Lord Tywin again and see how the situation develops." While some, like Lord Elise, appreciated this logical stance, Eddard saw men like Great John and Lord Rickard frowning, eager to join the battle. They would have to endure these pre-battle nerves for now. The North were not mindless barbarians, as many ignorant highborn in the South might envision, but they were deeply emotionally driven people. During winter, inaction, hesitation, and doubt were killers of their own, as sure as starvation and the cold. Eddard had managed to cultivate a two-sided respect with his lords and commanders, which made them hold their tongues in the face of his orders. He turned his horse once again and began the short ride back to Lord Tywin, who was now in a quiet discussion with his younger brother, Sir Kevin. Though he did not wish to intrude, he urged his horse forward upon seeing a lone red-cloaked rider making his way up the hill from the city. A sea of red banners and men continued to stream into the city through the large open gate. The shadows cast by the gate and the large walls obscured the courtyard on the other side, making it impossible to see what was happening immediately within. It seemed one of the lords sent in command wished to inform them. The rider quickly revealed himself to be a young man clad in a red surcoat with a golden lion fastened over his breast. The youth seemed quite nervous, though Eddard concluded that it was likely due to the present company. It was not every day a commoner played a significant role in any battle, especially for such an infamous lord as Lord Tywin. The two Lannister brothers noticed the rider's presence, and Lord Tywin gestured for the rider to deliver his message. The youth took a breath before bowing in his saddle. My lords, the gatehouse is being held by Sir Christopher's men. However, a force of Targaryen men-at-arms is holding us back from advancing into the city at every road and alley from the God's Gate. The messenger seemed to gain more confidence as he spoke. Lord Craighall is requesting better armed men to drive out the Targaryen loyalists as they are holding fiercely, as said. Lord Tywin looked down upon the rider in thought before his pale green eyes drifted past to the restless cavalry standing in reserve. No. The cavalry stays. We have the numbers, and they cannot hold eternally. I will reinforce and break through, Lord Tywin, Eddard declared. My men are ready and eager to fight. Letting the war drag on due to excessive caution will only increase casualties. We will take the city today and the keep tomorrow if it remains resistant. He had learned from both Winter and his brief time as a lord that temporary pain had to be endured for lasting good. In winter, greybeards walked into the snows, sacrificing themselves for an easier season for their families. In times of war, soldiers fought and sacrificed to protect their kin in the same way. This was their charge and fate, and Eddard would be right beside them. Deep within, Eddard wished the war would end today. Boy, do you know if Sir Christopher commands all the gold cloaks or only a faction? Eddard asked the messenger. The rider seemed startled and remained silent, his eyes darting from the ground to his grey ones. My lord. Sir Christopher only commands a faction of the gold cloaks. The ones defending the gatehouse. Eddard raised an eyebrow. So any gold cloak outside the gatehouse and courtyard are Targaryen loyalists? I thought Sir Christopher was the Lord Hand. The youth finally looks up into his eyes steadily. The captains of the other barracks were envious of Sir Christopher's initiative and jumped at the chance to fight against him. Very well, you have my gratitude, Eddard says slowly before fishing a gold dragon from one of the saddles of his horse and throwing it to the rider. Lord Tywin met his gaze, calculating as always. The lord did not say anything, leaving Eddard to his own resolve. As the rider departed toward the city, Eddard turned and rode back to his men. Great John and Lord Rickard were the first to move towards him, but soon all the commanders had gathered around. Will we ride? Great John's booming voice asked. We shall, Eddard stated simply before turning to Lord Rickard. The two lords were his best commanders, both in eagerness and strategy. Lord Rickard, I want you to stay here with the rest of the forces. I will ride with only half of our men initially, as it will not be practical to move more through the gate at once. Do not consider yourself beholden to Lannister, you speak with my voice and are answerable only to King Robert or Lord Arryn themselves. I will not hide, the temperamental lord began, but Eddard interrupted him. I am your liege lord. If I were to fall today, I want you to return to River Run and protect whatever child my wife may bear, before returning him or her north to Winterfell. These last few years have been cruel to the north, but we are not dead and defeated. Saving the future of the north is as much an honor as fighting by my side here, I assure you. This seemed to cool the man's emotions, and the proud lord soon bowed his head in submission. If such a tragedy were to occur, then I would be honored to protect the next generation of Starks. I pray to all the gods for your survival, but I will bear the duty and follow your will if not." Eddard nodded, appreciating the gravity of Rickard's commitment. He turned back to the assembled lords. "Prepare your men. We ride to reinforce the gatehouse and break through the Targaryen lines." With determined nods, the lords dispersed to command their men. Eddard ensured all were ready before lightly kicking the sides of his horse, urging the mount forward. His cavalry soon followed, and 700 of his force rode with him, first past Lord Tywin and his lords, and then past the heavy knights and cavalry of the west. The massive curtain walls loomed larger as he and his men, now more compact, rode with increasing speed toward the gatehouse. As they neared the tail of the snake-like column of Lannister infantry still outside the gate, Eddard noticed the stone depictions that gave the gate its name. Intricate carvings of the Seven adorned the large archway, casting shadows in the light of the rising sun. It was quite late in the morning now, and any precipitation had long evaporated in the increasing heat of the day. Suddenly appearing from the shadowed gate was a new rider. This one briefly glanced over at Eddard and his men with some confusion if he wasn't mistaken before riding past in haste. Eddard let the rider stay in his mind for a moment before he turned his attention back to the great gate and the now parting Lannister soldiers. Looking further into the tunnel, however, he saw it was little space for men, let alone his horses. Being mounted both had its advantages and cons. In this scenario, he eventually decided against them. "We dismount here and move in to reinforce." Eddard barked to his men as he slipped from his saddle, drawing his sword and turning to his men. They soon followed, and he left a score of men to handle the many horses as he led the others into the gatehouse. If they were to fight through alleys, it would be difficult to use their horses effectively. It would be unfortunate to lose such fine steeds when they could not be used to their full potential. Eddard had heard the sounds of battle for some time, but the noise became louder and more guttural as he and his men entered the gate. They made their way along one of the walls, squeezing past parting Lannisters who watched them silently. Along the wall and through the murder holes, Eddard saw no one. Wasn't the gatehouse meant to be held by gold cloaks? Sunlight grew stronger as they emerged from the thick walls of the city. Now Eddard could hear the clash of metal, the screams of the wounded and dying, and the unmistakable stench of death. He made his way through, and the sunlight blinded him for a few moments before the chaotic and desperate fight revealed itself to him. Dead and wounded littered the dusty courtyard, both cloaked in gold and red. While red-cloaked Lannisters held the courtyard, they must have lost control of the gatehouse, for there was clear fighting at both entrances. On the opposite side of the courtyard, 5 lines of Lannisters blocked each road into the city, though the passages were far better fortified than previously reported. Makeshift barricades made of everything from wagons to ale barrels and mismatched planks provided significant defense. Eddard spotted Lord Roland Craighall noticing his arrival and making his way over. The large Vestalender seemed both thankful and confused by their arrival. "You were fast. My messenger only just left," the Lord stated as they met. "I assume that Lord Tywin will be following." "Only just left?" Eddard echoed in confusion. It had surely been quite some time since the first rider had left with Craighall's messages. "What do you mean just now?" Lord Roland's hesitant smile fell into confusion as well. "The rider I sent out was to call for Lord Tywin and inform him that Sir Christopher never turned cloak and that we desperately need to capture the gatehouse." "Your first rider said that Sir Christopher held the gatehouse for us. That it was under our control," Eddard said slowly. Lord Roland's eyes widened in realization. "Gods be good," Lord Elise muttered behind him as they all reached the same conclusion. In his peripheral vision, Eddard noticed dark figures emerging atop the roofs of the surrounding houses, clearly holding drawn bows and loaded crossbows. At the first twang of a released arrow, Eddard hears screams both from the courtyard and from every road and alley around. "Ambush," Eddard shouted, raising his sword high. "Defensive positions. Shields up." His men responded swiftly, raising their shields and forming a tight defensive circle. Arrows and bolts rained down, clattering off the raised shields or finding unfortunate gaps. The Lannisters in the courtyard were caught off guard, their ranks thrown into disarray as the hidden Targaryen loyalists attacked from above. A loud groaning of metal and then horrified screams came from behind. Eddard already suspected what had happened before he whipped his head around and saw the portcullis closed, a dozen Westerlanders unfortunate enough to have been directly under it as it dropped. The sounds of panic, pain, and terror became a dull roar in his ears as he watched the scene unfold almost dispassionately. It was such an obvious trap in hindsight, he thought. It had been too good to be true. So had the stony sept been. Now it seemed his luck had been spent, the gods no longer merciful. Eddard saw the Lannisters outside the gates at first desperately trying to lift the great iron portcullis and help their trapped comrades. Then when heated sand was dropped from above, scream in pain and retreat from the gate, arrows, stones and heated sand forcing them to flee. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained down from the rooftops upon clusters of Lannister and Stark men still in the courtyard. Their side was helpless but to cower under their shields and endure the hail. They were surely 1,000 men strong or more, but with no way to retaliate their numbers were useless. This action would not work for long, either. Fresh gold-cloaked men suddenly flooded from the barricades, slaughtering the now exhausted Lannisters who had been fighting for nearly an hour to break through. Lord Roland had been barking orders for order and discipline when a bolt pierced his side, sending him from his mount. The Crake Hall still lived, shouting in pain from the ground beside Eddard. Eddard turned to his lords. Lord Elise looked resigned, raising his shield but leaving his sword limp in his hand. Greatjon, as expected, had charged toward the flood of gold cloaks and black-cloaked Targaryen men at arms. He was soon surrounded by 10 foes, still fighting bravely. Eddard lost sight of him soon enough. 3 deep horn blasts suddenly woke Eddard from his shocked state. The order for retreat, with northern horns, he noted. He turned and bumped into something. Looking down, he saw his blade lying on the sandy ground. He had not even felt it slip from his grip. He and his men were surrounded by an intimidating wall of spears by the gold cloaks before he could even think of picking up his sword. He had led his men to this fate, this impossible situation. His guards and lords formed a human shield around him, but he knew they all understood it was a lost cause. Their way of retreat was closed, even if they could escape this envelopment. Other groups of Lannisters and a second group of his Starks were similarly enveloped by hundreds of gold-cloaked men. "Drop your steel, be reasonable, and you will not lose your lives," a voice he recognized suddenly echoed around the courtyard. Eddard turned to look toward the voice. Sir Christopher Mudd had truly grown into a man now. The melee victor now wore fine plate armor, with a surcoat depicting the golden mud crown. Over his shoulder was a golden cape in the fashion of the gold cloaks, presumably to symbolize his past as commander of the City Watch. The man's sword was still sheathed. Seconds grew by in the now almost silent courtyard, interrupted only by moans and groans of pain. The first sword falling to the dusty ground echoed across the courtyard for a moment before it was soon joined by many others. Eddard's Northmen, however, remained resolute, raising their arms and weapons in response to the capitulation of their red-cloaked allies. It would only leave them dead to a man, and he would not leave them to death if he could help it. "Sir Christopher, will you swear on all gods old and new that my men will be unharmed if they surrender?" Eddard asked in a stronger voice than he thought himself capable of. Christopher turned to him and smiled lightly. "I vow that you and your men will remain unharmed if you all surrender here and now on the gods old and new," Christopher proclaimed in turn. Eddard closed his eyes for a moment. As Lord Stark, he had led more Northmen to their deaths than any predecessor in decades. Not even the Mad King had caused so many northern deaths as he. "As Lord Stark of Winterfell, drop your arms. Your loyalty warms my heart, but I do not wish it to be punished with your lives." His men hesitated for a moment before hundreds of swords, axes, spears, and other weapons crashed to the ground. "I am pleased by all of your cooperation. This war is not something any of us wanted or even started. I will be the one to end it, however, in one way or another, Sir Christopher stated loudly. Restrain them all and have the nobles held in Maegor's holdfast, Sir Christopher then ordered. The gold cloaks soon began dividing the groups and restraining tens of men together in long ropes before marching them away. Lord Eddard Stark did not resist as his hands were fastened together and 2 gold cloaks held onto each of his arms, for he had failed. Sir Christopher had won today, and it would remain to be seen if Eddard could see the end of this war after all. As Eddard was led away, he cast a final glance at the fallen and the wounded, a heavy weight settling in his chest. It did not seem like Sir Christopher wished them dead yet, which gave him a flicker of hope. Sir Christopher had become acquainted with Eddard's sister, perhaps he would be willing to return her to Winterfell. It was the only thing he could hope for now. Sir Christopher Mudd surveyed the aftermath of the ambush with grim satisfaction. The trap had been flawlessly executed, a feat that could only have been surpassed by capturing Lord Tywin himself. As it stood, the result was nearly as impressive. Lord Roland Craighall, a dozen Vestlander knights and minor lords, and most valuable of all, Lord Eddard Stark along with nearly all his commanding lords. Even the formidable Great John Umber, though gravely injured, was among the captives. Hornwood and Reed completed the list. Christopher allowed himself a moment of amusement. With the Lord of the Neck and the Stark of Winterfell in his custody, he held the keys to the north. Ironically, he had little reason to act on it for now. The Andal kings whom his forefathers had fought could only have dreamed of this, and now Christopher held it in his palm. He shook himself from those thoughts after a moment. This ambush had only succeeded through a series of perfectly laid plans, both cultivated by him and bolstered by luck. Christopher had laborers worked tirelessly through the night and the days leading up to the meeting, building sturdy barricades to ensure there were no alternative routes but those 5. They installed ladders on the opposite side of the houses, allowing archers to wait and then climb onto the roofs for the ambush. Sir Alliser Thorne and Sir Jeremy Rugger had been convinced to lead the Targaryen household guard tasked with holding the barricades until the ambush. The 2 knights, some of the few left at King's Landing after both the Bells and the Trident, were no friends of his but were fierce loyalists and acknowledged his position as Lord Regent and Hand. They performed admirably, both knights and men-at-arms, managing to hold out against the Lannister assault. Hundreds of small folk with pieces of metal had been brought in to create the sounds of battle and struggle, initially creating the illusion of a mutiny. They were replaced by his armed watchmen when the first Lannisters appeared at the gate. The watchmen had been ordered to lose ground into the alleys, luring the Lannisters further until they met the barricades and were replaced by the Targaryen men-at-arms. And, of course, his 2 ultimate deceptions, the cloaked Jaime Lannister and the messenger. Both had been the same Red Keep stable hand, chosen personally by Christopher for his ability to ride a horse and his desperate desire to provide for his family. Living in Flea Bottom, the stable hand was already lucky to work for the Targaryens at the Red Keep and had jumped at the chance to earn 1,000 gold dragons from Christopher's Harrenhal winnings. It seemed the Lannister soldiers had thought the man a scout as he was let out from the King's Gate by the Blackwater Rush and then sent north past the Gate of the Gods to the Lannister camp. The man had known he would be the first messenger and free to tell his lies to the Lion of Lannister for as long as the white banner flew from atop the gatehouse. Which it had, resulting in the greatest victory for the royalists yet and a very wealthy stable hand. Christopher hoped the man would spend it wisely. The coins were now his, and he could retire from his job and live comfortably for decades if he was frugal. Lord Hand. Christopher turned to one of Adam's lieutenants, the one who had held the gatehouse itself. Lieutenant Edwell, you have done the Crown and me a great service. I understand that all assaults upon the gatehouse were repelled. The lieutenant shook his head firmly. They pushed us back up the stairs almost to the pulleys of the portcullis, but with the help of its operators, we eventually drove them back after a bloody fight out into the courtyard. Then you have earned my gratitude, Christopher started, only to be interrupted by the lieutenant. My apologies, my lord, But the archers on the wall wish to inform you that the horses of the Northmen still remain by the walls, defended by a score of Northmen. They seem too few to move the large number and are unwilling to abandon them. The Lannister infantry were driven off by our archers when they retook their positions on the wall after the ambush, but there is a force of Northmen on its way down the hill now, presumably whatever force Lord Stark left at the siege camp. Hundreds of horses with a minor force defending them were too tempting, as the capital was short of good war horses. Christopher had feared he would need to import horses, but now hundreds stood just outside his walls. Send out a few hundred guardsmen to capture these mounts. And send a rider to retrieve Lord Stark. I wish for him to be brought up on the wall. Any northern force will either be hesitant or entirely unwilling to sacrifice their lord, even for such a number of horses. Let them know what will happen if they do not let our men capture the horses, though do not kill him regardless, simply bluff. Christopher ordered as he looked toward the gatehouse. Have it done. You speak with my voice now. The man rushed off, barking orders to his sergeants and watchmen. Christopher did not care about the lieutenant's interruption, but was irritated that the archer's information came second to the reporting of battles won. Hopefully, the plan would still be successful. 700 bred and trained war horses, even light cavalry as the Northmen had, were a gift from the gods. He had faith they would succeed or inform him if not. Christopher mounted his horse and began his ride back to the Red Keep, now accompanied by his personal household guard. This unit comprised his original 5 guards, who had been with him since before Harrenhal, along with 15 additional guards financed by the Crown through his office as Hand. The justification for this expenditure was simple: he controlled both sides of the deal. These 20 guards now either served as his personal guard or protected the Tower of the Hand, where he now resided. It struck him that this was his first permanent home since leaving Sow's Horn. For 3 years, he had lived in tents, inns, or barracks. The chambers of the commander of the watch were functional but Spartan, as each new commander decorated the space with their own personal effects. The Tower of the Hand, meanwhile, was a true part of the Red Keep and was decorated as such. Tapestries from previous hands and the Targaryens graced most rooms. His sleeping chamber possessed the most comfortable bed he had ever lain in and was further adorned with numerous chairs and sofas. His personal chambers even had 2 vanities. He had never seen one before, but from the moment he did, the arrogance of his many predecessors seemed less surprising. There was also a fireplace, almost always lit and maintained by the servants. Christopher had only dreamt of personal servants until joining the Gold Cloaks, where junior watchmen followed orders from their senior officers. Now, however, he had personal servants maintaining his tower and answering to him. In theory, they were on his payroll, though in reality, this too was financed by the Crown. After all, who would stop him? Now, with the lions bloodied, the North decapitated, and the stag absent, Christopher could not help but truly consider victory and a future after the war. He envisioned himself as Hand, holding a keep, perhaps with a wife and children. Maybe he could even see old stones rebuilt. He had never seen the ancestral lands of House Mud apart from maps. He imagined a ruined keep atop a hill with the Green Fork flowing past slowly. He hoped that he would see it someday. This victory still depended on the actions of one lord, however. If he would finally move his ass from the feasts outside of Storm's End or not. The Tyrells had not responded to Christopher's last missive and continued to starve the Baratheon castle. Now, with this victory, Christopher hoped to lure the Fat Rose from the capture of Storm's End to the even greater glory of saving King's Landing. As Christopher and his men traveled the familiar road from his old Gold Cloak post to the Red Keep, they were passed by a mounted Gold Cloak at full gallop. Soon after, they passed Lord Eddard Stark being escorted back to the gate. The defeated lord had his head lowered and did not notice Christopher's presence. Around them, small folk hurled insults at the Lord of Winterfell or praised Christopher and his victory. News of the ambush and its success had already spread far from the gate. It would be expensive for the Targaryens to have the Tyrells and the Reach save them, but that was a price they would have to endure if they wished to remain rulers of the Seven Kingdoms. The throne would be won by Christopher's and Tyrell's hands. This was something Christopher had realized and now had the time to act upon. The future king and his sister were young and impressionable. If he did not wish to end like Lord Unwin Peake, he would need to build some relationships. Once again, there was a young king named Aegon and an ambitious hand. This time, it was the sixth Aegon, not the third, but Christopher did not wish to repeat that history. That was his thought as he finally arrived at the Red Keep after an hour of riding. A rider informed him, as he dismounted in the keep's courtyard, that the capture of the horses had been successful. Lord Karstark, who had led the Northern Rescue Force, had been forced to retreat at the sight of his captured liege lord and a hail of arrows from the walls. The score of Northmen defending the horses had been more resistant but were badly outnumbered and soon killed to the last man before the gold cloaks brought the horses into the city. The horses would be stabled where possible in both Gold Cloak barracks and the manses of absent lords until they were needed. Christopher thanked the rider before entering the Red Keep. His first stop was the Rookery. He had appointed one of Pycelle's aides, Maester Allard, as interim Grand Maester until a new one could be sent by the citadel. Christopher had Robin and his spies investigate Maester Allard's background to ensure his trustworthiness. They found that Allard was a new arrival at the outbreak of the war, sent to care for the Ravens, and was largely unaffiliated with the disgraced Pycelle. This had been sufficient for Christopher to make the appointment. Maester Allard opened his chambers immediately and was as courteous as ever. Christopher instructed him to send a new message to Lord Tyrell, detailing the recent victory and reiterating promises of the Master of Coin position and a betrothal between the king and Tyrell's daughter. He also asked that the message urged Tyrell to march north to meet where the King's Road crossed the Wendwater, leaving a force under someone like Sir John Fossaway at Storm's End to maintain the siege. Maester Allard nodded as Christopher finished and promised to have the message delivered immediately. Satisfied, Christopher left the Rookery and made his way to Maegor's Holdfast and then the royal chambers. Servants and guards alike paid him their respects with courtesies and bows, but none interrupted his walk, and he soon found himself outside the chambers of Princess Elia and her children. Queen Mother Elia, he corrected himself as he knocked on the door. Only 2 regular Targaryen guards stood outside the chambers, a stark reminder of the depleted Kingsguard. 2 were dead, 1 had been captured, another arrested, and the last 3 had been missing for a year. He hoped they at least lived, lest he be forced to rebuild the knightly order from the ground up. That would be a daunting task and likely beyond his expertise. After all, who was truly worthy to appoint knights that became so legendary? Almost all boys in the Seven Kingdoms dreamt at least once of joining the famed order. The door opened hesitantly, startling Christopher from his thoughts. Even the frailty of her body did not diminish the beauty of Elia Martell. Exotic though her features might be, there was no denying her allure. Her dark eyes, shifting distrustfully from him to the 2 household guards flanking the door, held a beauty of their own. "Your Grace," Christopher began, bowing respectfully. "May I have a word?" "What can I do for the Lord Hand?" the Dornish woman replied. Christopher let his face settle into an easy smile, hiding his more selfish intentions for the moment. "If you let me enter, I will explain." The Queen Mother opened the door a little more but still stood blocking it, a gesture that, while symbolic, would do little to prevent his entry if he truly wished to force his way in. The gods were cruel to give her a body that did not match her soul and spirit. Perhaps a stronger physique might have allowed this woman to prevent her late husband's foolish actions and avoided this war entirely. "I gather from your attitude that the ambush was successful," Elia said, her tone laced with a touch of sarcasm. As sharp as ever, both in tongue and mind, Christopher responded, his smile widening slightly. He had heard only of Elia's kindness and gentleness during his time at Harrenhal, but it seemed she possessed a bit of Dornish fire as well. "Though I would feel more comfortable discussing the details sitting." Elia hesitated for a moment before stepping back, her eyes betraying a hint of reluctance. She said nothing as he nodded in thanks and entered the chambers. The door clicked shut behind him. Christopher's gaze was drawn to young Rhaenys, who stood protectively in front of a crib. The little girl's resemblance to her mother was striking: olive skin, dark hair, and black eyes that mirrored Elia's. "A pleasure to meet you personally, Princess Rhaenys," Christopher said, offering a courteous bow. The girl's eyes flickered between him and her mother, but she remained silent. Elia, maintaining her distance, glanced pointedly at her daughter. "This is Sir Christopher Mudd, Aegon's regent and hand, as I have told you. Say hello." Rhaenys hesitated before mumbling, "Hello," still standing guard-like in front of the crib. Christopher turned to Elia. "Would it be possible to greet young Aegon as well?" Elia met his gaze for a few long moments, her expression inscrutable. "If he is awake," she finally said. Christopher nodded and began to walk toward the crib. Rhaenys continued to stand resolutely, her small figure unwavering as if to shield her brother from any intrusion. "I wish your brother no harm, Princess," Christopher said gently. "May I pass?" The girl looked up at him with a gaze reminiscent of her mother's, clearly scrutinizing him for any sign of deception. "Only if you promise not to hurt him," she demanded, her tone as serious as her little face was adorable. Christopher hid his amusement behind a mask of solemnity and nodded gravely. "I vow upon the gods that I will not harm your brother or you, not now or ever." The solemnity of his promise seemed to satisfy the young princess. She stepped aside, still standing close to the crib, her eyes never leaving him. Christopher approached slowly, mindful of the delicate balance he wished to maintain. Peering into the crib, he was met by the alert gaze of the infant king. Little Aegon had inherited his father's striking Valyrian features, purple eyes and a head of silver hair, though it was short and soft. Christopher extended a cautious hand toward the baby. The boy's lilac eyes followed the movement, and after a moment of curious contemplation, he reached out and grasped Christopher's finger with his tiny, firm grip. Christopher smiled genuinely as he watched the child's curiosity and innocence. After a moment, Christopher withdrew his hand from the crib, prompting the infant Aegon to release his tiny grasp. He first turned to Rhaenys, who, having replaced her initial distrust with curiosity, watched him with renewed interest. Then he glanced at Elia, whose conflicted expression quickly vanished behind an emotionless mask. "You wished to talk about the battle, did you not, my lord?" Elia inquired, her tone softer than when he first arrived. Perhaps she had discerned his deeper motivations. While he didn't believe it would be of major concern, he preferred not to spell it out explicitly in case she took issue with it. "Indeed, Your Grace," Christopher replied, as he moved toward a pair of chairs in her chambers. He gestured for her to join him, and Elia took a seat with a slight nod. Rhaenys remained near the crib, her gaze flicking between the adults with cautious curiosity. Christopher began to recount the details of the ambush and the subsequent victory. As he described the deceptions and the decisive triumph, Elia's eyes widened with each new revelation. The mention of captured hostages seemed to spark a glimmer of hope in her dark eyes, a flicker that Christopher caught despite her efforts to remain composed. For they had won, and the ashes of hope had gained a flicker of life. The cause was not dead yet, and it seemed Christopher had finally convinced Elia that he may not be entirely a lost cause. For now the winds had shifted yet again. There was a brief lull, a moment where one could ask themselves what way the winds would blow next. The Lord of Highgarden. If there was one thing Christopher did not like about the Tower of the Hand, it was the stairs, long and winding, with rooms spread across all the floors. He guessed they kept him in shape, if nothing else. Servants gave their courtesies to him as he descended the staircase, eventually reaching the ground floor. He had been interrupted while breaking his fast this morning by a missive from Maester Allard, informing him that they had finally received word from Lord Tyrell. It seemed his victory a few days prior had piqued the interest of the self-important lord. Christopher had one port of call before the rest of the council arrived for the meeting. He was keen to speak with the captured Lord Stark, a task he hadn't managed to find time for since the battle. The Warden of the North had been given comfortable, if secure, chambers in Maegor's Holdfast, a little apart from the royal quarters, befitting a great lord such as himself. Christopher would now discover if Stark was grateful for this privilege or not. No lord or highborn had been put in the black cells or dungeons, but neither had they been granted chambers in the heart of Maegor's holdfast like Lord Eddard had received. The corridors were quiet but for the steady marching of Christopher and his constant guards. He was quite satisfied with their appearance now. Castle-forged swords hung at their hips, and they were clad in boiled leather with brown tabards displaying his mud crown on their chests. Helmets with narrow steel nose guards completed their attire. All in all, they looked like proper household guards of a proper noble house. The fact that he did not even need to pay them any more wasn't lost on him, though when other powers entered King's Landing, he would ensure to regain control of their payrolls and make sure they could not be easily bought off. They soon passed into the holdfast, and after no time at all, he arrived at the door guarded by 2 gold cloaks assigned to Lord Stark by Adam. One of the gold cloaks bowed to him as he stood before the door, then banged loudly. "You have a visitor, Lord Stark." "Stand away from the door," the gold cloak ordered, briefly peering through a small hole at the side before unlocking the door with a key from his belt. "Milord," the guard finally said. Christopher nodded to show his gratitude but did not address either watchman as he passed through the door and entered. The chambers were windowless, except for slits near the ceiling along 2 walls, allowing some natural light to push away the shadows. Still, it was quite dark, and numerous candles were scattered around, though Lord Eddard seemed to have left them unlit since they were last replaced by the servants. Sir Christopher, Eddard Stark greeted him, seated at a desk in the farthest corner of the room, where a lone flame flickered beside him. Laying on the desk was a tome the Lord seemed to be reading. "Lord Hand now, I suppose," Stark soon corrected. "Either is fine, my lord. I am not here to discuss such semantics and waste your time," Christopher replied calmly as he moved to a seat near the desk and Eddard. "Your rise has been most impressive. I must admit, I did not think I would ever see you again after that tourney," Lord Stark said, turning to look at him directly. "The right place at the right time," Christopher said humbly. The North were not fond of southern braggarts, and he did not care to test Lord Eddard's patience for such. "Time after time," the Northern Lord replied, watching him steadily. Christopher imagined that Stark wasn't very pleased or comfortable with his situation, but none of this showed in the Northman's expressionless face. "The gods give and they take, some more than others, in both ways." Eddard remained silent at his comment, so Christopher continued after a few moments. "A great injustice has been done upon your house. I had nothing to do with it, but even if I did, I would not defend those dishonorable actions." Eddard's lips slightly grimaced, showing little care for Christopher's denunciations. He supposed there was little to be said quite yet. What was the Northman to do? Thank him for his words? "You know I met your elder brother upon his arrival at King's Landing." This finally seemed to catch Eddard's interest, though not in a positive way, judging by how his expression darkened. "Your brother was not hard to befriend, and I certainly developed an appreciation for him over that tourney. We were no great friends, but he was always friendly, gregarious, and helpful." Christopher paused briefly to assess the Stark's reaction. Eddard seemed more confused now, his brows furrowed. "So when my men reported that your brother and his companions were outside my gate, demanding justice for the abduction of his sister, I was fearful. I had heard both whispers and screams of what happened to those our previous king thought traitors or threats. I rode as quickly as I could and briefly talked with him. Before I could dissuade him from his course of action, however, a force led by Lord Commander Hightower and the commander of the City Watch arrived and arrested him without further ado. After this, I ended up with some unpleasantness, resulting in me receiving a whipping and being bedridden for quite some time. I must have fallen ill during the injury, for when I awoke, Lord Rickard had already arrived, and the injustice had been done. If I ever could have done something, it would have been before he was taken into the custody of the crown." Christopher ended with a remorseful expression on his face. It was no hard thing to do, as he did wish the 2 Starks had not suffered such grim fates, but Brandon had been a brief acquaintance, and it was now nearly 2 years ago. Eddard finally nodded, his expression softer and less judgmental. It seems you did all in your power, considering. Eddard trailed off before smiling slightly, though it was a sad smile. I always knew his wolf blood would get him in trouble, but I thought it would lead to nothing more than a few scandals with maidens and such, as it had before. Never that it would lead to his death. I imagine many a maiden and lady cried when the news of his end reached them, Christopher commented lightly. Indeed, Eddard nodded slowly. After a few moments, he suddenly straightened in his seat. Now, I don't imagine you simply visited me to reminisce? Christopher nodded firmly, his demeanor becoming serious. You would be correct, we have ultimately ended up on opposite sides of this war. While I hope both of us survive this, that cannot happen if you don't give me something to work with. Eddard looked at him with a guarded expression in his grey eyes. What would this something be? If you think I would betray my honor and kin, then you are foolishly mistaken. And I do not wish for you to betray your kin. I realize you will not do it without further incentives, for you are far too selfless to bend for your own situation. Therefore, I will add some incentives, Christopher explained bluntly. Eddard seemed a little shocked, remaining silent before Christopher continued. There was one who survived King Aerys' actions, your brother's squire, Ethan Glover. Christopher raised a hand as Eddard looked ready to speak in anger. I only recently learned of his survival and presence in the dungeons. As a sign of good faith, I will have him moved up from the dungeons into chambers like yours. Eddard seemed hesitant, perhaps waiting for the other boot to drop. I am pleased to hear of his survival, he finally said. As am I now. Know that as long as I remain Hand of the King, no reparations, cruel tariffs, or other sanctions will be levied upon the North or House Stark. In exchange, I require information on Lord Lannister's scouts, how many, where, when, and specifically any present south of the Blackwater Rush, Christopher inquired. Eddard furrowed his eyebrows for a few moments, his thoughts clearly whirring behind his grey eyes. Lord Tyrell is on the march, the Northman stated eventually. Christopher raised an eyebrow, hiding his genuine surprise at Stark's statement. He quickly considered the implications and decided that the risk of Eddard knowing this was mitigated by his secure chambers and constant guard. Indeed, I must commend you on your reasoning, he eventually replied. Eddard's eyebrows furrowed further. Surely you must know that you cannot have them march up the King's Road. At worst, in your case, they would be ambushed by Lannister forces or he would flee north to Robert. It would break the siege, but there would be little sense in consolidating your enemy's forces, Eddard concluded, though it seemed he hadn't discovered Christopher's actual plan. This is true, but you need not concern yourself with it. It matters little for you, Christopher said steadily. I would rather you tell me how deep the Lannister scouts are in the Kingswood. Are they just over the Rush, or further in? Eddard's eyes narrowed before he spoke. When I was last briefed, they were 10 to 15 men strong over the river and ranging down the King's Road from time to time. They mostly returned within a day to report, so not terribly far. This was useful information. I see. Where are the majority of Lannister's scouts then? They are to the west, ensuring the safety of resupply caravans. He has a force of cavalry in reserve at all times to ride out and defend any caravans upon the Gold Road when they leave the Westerlands, from where the Gold Road crosses the Blackwater Rush. And to the north? Christopher raised an eyebrow. Eddard hesitated for a moment. In the terms of Lannister scouts, I don't believe there were many, some northern ones, but that may have changed now with everything. Christopher nodded, absorbing the information. Thank you, Lord Stark. This will be valuable in our efforts. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. He rose from his seat and walked to the door, pausing to give a respectful nod to the Northern Lord before opening it. Wait. Christopher stopped and turned back to Eddard. It is concerning my sister. One of the guards at the door leaned over to him. Milord, a servant arrived to say that the council has gathered in the small council chambers, he said in a low voice. Christopher turned his head slightly. I will not be long. Close the door. The door clicked shut as he turned back to the Northern Lord, his face now filled with some desperation. Yes? There is only my brother at Winterfell and her left in my family. Eddard began before Christopher interrupted him. I am afraid that I only know she is. Presumably guarded by the 3 missing Kingsguard knights. I never discussed it with the prince, it was not my position to do so. She is at least protected by 3 of the greatest knights in the realm, if that is any comfort, Christopher concluded, though somewhat wryly. Greatest was up for interpretation. Greatest warriors, no doubt, but knights were not supposed to abduct noble ladies, as far as he remembered from his vows. Sir Barristan told me the Lady Ashara probably was in contact with her brother and that they were someplace in Dawn, Eddard informed him. Ashara Dane? Eddard nodded. I see, though I am afraid that is still not something I will be able to act on presently, Christopher replied. It would hopefully allow him to retrieve the missing Kingsguard if they had not gone rogue or worse. I understand, but please, I would forever be in your debt if you returned my sister to Winterfell, Eddard pleaded. Christopher looked at the Lord for a moment before nodding. If it is within my ability, I will do all I can to accomplish it, but I cannot promise this. Eddard remained silent for a moment before he nodded silently. I must attend the council now. Rest assured, I will keep your concerns in mind, Christopher said earnestly as he departed. As Christopher and his guards walked through the Red Keep, 2 of his men had to walk in front, creating a path for him as the servants rushed to and fro, tidying the rooms of the now awoken castle before attending to their other duties. When he arrived at the doors to the small council chamber, they were closed. 2 of his guards dramatically opened them for him. He walked into the room with purpose, his guards remaining outside to stand watch. The small council chamber was already abuzz with conversation. As Christopher entered, the murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He took his seat at the right hand of the empty king's seat. There would still be quite some years until it was occupied, if Christopher had anything to say about it. Lord Velaryon sat at the end of the table in the seat of his office. Though he had grown more comfortable in these meetings, he still mostly remained silent, observing more than participating. Varys, the enigmatic master of whisperers, was seated opposite Christopher, his observant eyes watching every council member. Christopher's cousin and best friend sat beside Varys on the master of whispers' right. Both were waiting attentively for Christopher to speak. He ensured to catch their eyes and give them a nod of greeting. Finally, the interim Grand Maester, Allard, sat on Christopher's right. Queen Mother Elia had been invited but had seemingly chosen not to attend today. Christopher decided that there was no reason to wait any longer and stood up. I must apologize for my tardiness, my lords. There is a lot to go through today for Baratheon marches ever closer. Lord Tyrell and his host is starting to reinforce us now, and this discrepancy will be something to solve today. Let us begin. He looked to Maester Allard, who was seated to his right, and nodded. I believe Maester Allard has something he wishes to bring to the council. Maester Allard had quickly proven his worth and diligence to Christopher. The fact that he wasn't old enough to have witnessed the dragons personally was a positive as well. Christopher had visited the imprisoned Grand Maester Pycelle twice now. The first time, Pycelle had tried his dithering old man act before growing desperate and angry on the second visit, revealing his true nature. Maester Allard rose and gave Christopher a small bow as he sat down in his chair. The man pulled a small missive from his robes and unrolled it in his hands. I received a raven in the early morning hours from Lord Tyrell, its seal unbroken. I presumed to open it in case the news could not wait for this council meeting. This was unnecessary as he simply wished to inform the Lord Hand that he was on the march and had heeded his words to leave a smaller force under his good brother, Sir John Fossaway, to maintain the siege. The Maester paused for a moment as Robin banged his empty wine cup quickly upon the table, drawing some attention. The Lord also wished to give the Lord Hand congratulations for his victory and gratitude for his council seat and daughter's betrothal. The Maester bowed once again, handing the parchment to him. He grabbed the missive and read it over quickly. "This is good news," he eventually said, his eyes rising to meet his councillors once again. I envisioned 3 great steps to win this war and defeat the rebels. The first was successfully defending King's Landing. This, I believe, we have managed. The lion has been bloodied and may even give up and wait for Baratheon. Christopher rose from his seat again, walking over to one of the walls where a map of the Crownlands and the immediate surroundings was depicted on a stand. He lifted the stand behind the chair of the king, allowing all to see as he first pointed south to the Kingswood. My second step is to involve Lord Tyrell and his men. I have discovered from a talk with our captured Lord Stark that Lannister scouts have been sent south of Blackwater Rush specifically to report the approach of this very host. Christopher gestured to the river flowing south of King's Landing and the small depiction of the King's Road to Storm's End. They will hopefully remain undiscovered, as I wish for them to flank around and arrive from an unexpected direction, Christopher revealed. Maester Allard had a thoughtful look on his face. Toward Tumbleton and then north to the Gold Road? That would be quite the detour. We do not possess an unlimited amount of time, I am afraid, the Maester concluded. He intends the opposite, over the bay, Lord Lucerys suddenly commented, as Christopher meant to reply to the Maester. Precisely. Using our royal fleet, we shall ferry as many of the Reachmen over the bay as possible, to either land at Stokeworth or Rosby. From there, they will make haste to the King's Road. Do you have any thoughts on this, Lord Velaryon? The Master of Ships sighed. The entire coast of Massey's Hook is hilly and rocky. At times they are sheer cliffs, barely possible to dock a small cog, never mind embark an entire army. Where do you intend to have the Reachmen get on these ships? Christopher nodded as he too looked toward the map. Tracing his fingers west from the Hook and Castle of Stonedance, he stopped by the lands of House Bywater and the mouth of the Wendwater. If I'm not mistaken, the coast off of the Bywater lands is more agreeable to our intentions, with a smattering of fishing villages and the like. He turned back to the Velaryon Lord. Would you concur? Lord Velaryon tapped his fingers on the table in thought. There are no ports in the area, and I admit I've never more than sailed past on the way to King's Landing, but if it is sufficiently deep, then I suppose, with the help of calm seas and small boats, it is possible to embark an army of some size there. Now, this is still too slow, I'm afraid. If the Master of Coin had marched upon receiving my first letter, the Reachmen would already be at Bywater. But that's neither here nor there, Christopher commented, taking a sip of his wine. I wish to enlighten you, my lords, on the efforts Varys and I have engaged in to change this situation. Christopher noticed he had the attention and some surprise from every councillor except the Master of Whisperers. A few days ago, I sent letters to the Cracklaw houses that have not been levied in past battles. Under the command of a Lord Brune, this host, which I can confirm is currently raising their banners, will aim to lure Robert Baratheon and his forces from the King's Road into the countryside of the Crownlands, Christopher explained. Will this work to delay him, then? Are we sure he would track down what, 1,000? A few thousand men? Robin finally asked. It seemed others had been wondering the same thing, as they all turned to Christopher for an answer. A fine question. To answer it, yes, Christopher stated simply. Pointing to the area north of King's Landing and the King's Road, he elaborated, Robert Baratheon has proven himself quite proficient in the matters of war, but he is very aggressive. A storm only moves forward, one might say. Christopher grinned for a moment. It is my belief that he would not want to leave an army, even one so inferior, at his back. Upon hearing of it, he will surely work to eliminate the Cracklaw host. Christopher then gestured toward Varys. Now, I believe Varys may be able to provide more insight into Robert Baratheon's situation and current intelligence. Lord Hand, the perfumed bald man, bowed his head as he rose from his chair. The Stag's host is still some distance from King's Landing. The last report indicated he was at Harrenhal, and he has yet to pass Butterwell. This means he will be here in a week if he marches as hard as possible. Christopher noticed Robin and Adam nodding at the information the Master of Whisperers revealed. Our main advantage is that Baratheon is unaware of the Battle of the Gate and Lord Stark's capture. I have men disguised as simple small folk in the Butterwell lands, ready to inform the Stormlord about the Crackclaw army and its intention to flank and cut off any escape north via the King's Road. As long as he remains unaware of recent events in the city, this will hopefully compel him to pursue Lord Brune's host. Christopher looked around the room, ensuring the gravity of their plan was understood. This is the plan, and if he does not bite, then I am afraid we will have to return to the drawing board, he added with some gallows humor. Now, with Robert hopefully distracted for some time, we must turn our attention to the situation with Lord Tyrell and the Reach. He took another sip of his wine before continuing. I will take a small retinue of trusted men and sail to Bywater. There, I will identify a suitable location for the royal fleet to embark the Reachman army. After this, we will ride down to Chittering Brook and meet Lords Tyrell and Tarley at the bridge crossing of the Wendwater. There was a stunned silence before Adam, Robin, and Lord Lucerys shouted their objections. He let their protests continue for a minute or two, simply watching as they voiced concerns about the risks and emphasized that he was the man holding the royalist side together. Maester Allard remained silent, though he seemed uneasy. Christopher knew Allard to be a man who would voice his opinions after thoughtful consideration. Varys simply stared at him, his dark eyes revealing nothing. Christopher raised a hand, and the three soon grew quiet. I have heard your thoughts, but this is something that I must do. Turning to Robin and Adam, he addressed them directly. I want one of you with me while the other stays to maintain the situation in my absence. Robin, I believe you would be the best to accompany me. Adam's face reddened, a trait he inherited from his knightly father. And what if Lord Tyrell takes you hostage? Then what? He has done more for the rebels than fucking Tywin Lannister with his inaction these past years, and now you will trust him with your safety? He and Adam stared at each other unflinchingly. It was rare for Adam to lose his temper like this. They had both grown up with his grandsire's teachings of never revealing their true feelings to those they did not completely trust. It warmed his heart to see his chosen brother care so deeply, but this changed nothing. You, my dear Adam, will stay here in King's Landing with the king and his closest family within grasp. Even if Lord Tyrell were cunning and grasping enough to take me hostage, I would inform him that you hold the lives of the royal family in your hands, Christopher explained in a cold, factual voice. However, this will not be necessary. Lord Mace is deluded enough to think himself quite chivalrous and would consider it dishonorable, or at least a bad look in front of his lords, to take me hostage. Christopher waited for a moment as silence reigned before he looked behind him and out to the balcony that overlooked the city from the small council chambers. I leave within the day if we are able to procure a ship or boat that can take us over the bay. He informed the council. I believe we should adjourn for a luncheon before we finish this meeting. I will have servants retrieve you in around an hour, Christopher announced. The meeting had already been quite long, and he felt the need for a break. The chambers were soon filled with the scraping of chairs as the councillors rose to their feet. Christopher turned back to see them all bow to him before all but Robin departed swiftly. His cousin looked at him for a moment. May we share a meal? I think I have heard something you would be interested in, which we can discuss more privately. Christopher nodded, knowing Robin had probably received new rumors from his informants. It happened from time to time, and Christopher was always grateful for his cousin's scheme to turn them into valuable sources of information. They were seated in his eating chambers in the Tower of the Hand not long after, as servants placed plates of warm venison in front of them. It was good to be Hand of the King, Christopher thought. So, what did you wish to tell me? Christopher asked once they had taken a few bites. Robin leaned in slightly, his voice low. One of my girls entertained a talkative sailor who recently arrived from Duskendale. Details from the Trident have yet to truly reach the city, but the sailor said that in Duskendale there was talk among many subjects that Lord Went had lost his two eldest sons at the Trident fighting for the rebels and that he has withdrawn all his men and family to Harrenhal. Christopher's thoughts whirred. The possibility of marriage with Lord Went's daughter, Lady Sarah, did not seem unthinkable even with the war. He had believed that he had left an impression on her the last time they met, and with her now isolated in the massive, dilapidated castle, she might appreciate a renewed connection. "This is interesting news, Robin," Christopher said, considering his next move. If Lord Went is indeed retreating to Harrenhal, it could be an opportunity. It may be too late to involve him in this war, but it would be good to show him a connection and alliance of sorts for after the war. Robin has an inquisitive look upon his face. "I am sure your thoughts aren't entirely innocent either, dear cousin." Christopher returned his cousin's grin. "I think we both left an impression upon the other," was his simple words as Robin simply smiled wider. "I would say so. It was not difficult to notice her throwing glances toward you, giggling with her handmaids," Robin teased lightly. Christopher rolled his eyes with a small smile on his face. He leaned back in his chair. "I'll send a letter to Lord Went expressing condolences for his loss and hinting at support in the post-war period." Robin raised an eyebrow. "I suppose it would be possible to accompany it with a personal message for Lady Sarah." "How romantic," Robin said ironically, and Christopher felt his smile sour. "Yeah, well, that's the world I've chosen," he stated simply. "I will write it personally and hope that it actually does help her slightly, irrelevant of any possible alliance and gain." His cousin nodded. "That is good. Just write them both now, and I will deliver them to Maester Allard after the meeting is finished." Christopher sighed before walking to a desk and retrieving his writing supplies. The letter to Lord Went was efficient, offering his condolences for the death of the man's sons and hinting at what Christopher might be able to do for House Went in exchange for an alliance. He rolled it up, poured the wax, and found a newly acquired mud seal, which he pressed into the hot wax. Blowing upon it, he looked up to see Robin finishing the rest of his luncheon. It seemed Christopher would have to eat the rest of his food after the meeting. Laying the letter to the side, he prepared another parchment for Lady Sarah. This letter was still succinct but carried a more genuine tone, mentioning her place in his thoughts. It would hopefully remind her of him, as cruelly calculating as that sounded. It was an ugly world, and it had tragically little time for heartwarming and innocent romances. He read over the letter carefully, ensuring it conveyed the right balance of sincerity and subtlety. Satisfied, he sealed it and handed both letters to Robin as he returned to the table. "I think it is time to resume the council session," Christopher said, even as he sent a longing look at the barely eaten plate. The servants could hopefully prepare him another one when he was finally finished with the council today. "Very well, cousin. The sooner we hold the meeting, the sooner I can pack and prepare for our journey," Robin stated as they left the chambers to descend down the tower. Within the next hour, all councillors had returned to the small council and were seated, ready. Christopher was now seated, the map having been put to the side again. He cleared his throat as he watched each and every councillor. "Now, let us continue." He briefly looked down upon a small scroll of his outlining the points of the meeting. "Right. Adam, you wish to report?" His friend nodded as he rose to his feet. "Indeed, my gold cloaks informed me today that numerous trees have been felled by the Lannisters and that they seem to be constructing siege works. I have to admit that I wish to hear the opinion of the council before deciding upon a course of action. This was not unexpected, but it showed that Lord Tywin meant to stay his hand for now. Whether the Lannisters intended to wait for Robert Baratheon or simply wished to level the playing field, Christopher did not know. Nevertheless, it was something they needed to disrupt, ideally destroy, before the Lannisters could mount a new assault. The Battle of the Gate had been costly for the Lannisters, but it hadn't been bloodless for the Gold Cloaks and especially not the Targaryen household guard. Sir Jeremy and Sir Alliser had lost many good men holding the Lannisters back. The city's defenders were still outnumbered and outclassed by the Vestalender knights and men-at-arms. The council had grown silent as they contemplated their own suggestions. Christopher looked to Lord Lucerys for a moment as a plan began to form in his head. "Lord Lucerys," Christopher said to the Master of Ships. "Yes, Lord Hand?" Everyone looked to Christopher as the Velaryon replied. Christopher stood to better be seen by the men. "Would your shipwrights in the city be able, under the instructions of a siege engineer, to construct our own counter-catapults to sabotage the besiegers? Lord Velaryon looked a little surprised by his question before growing thoughtful. Where would you acquire a siege engineer? I don't think the gold cloaks would be educated in such matters. Christopher nodded. This was the crux: where to find a siege engineer? The fighting men with such knowledge, after all, marched with Lord Connington and then the prince, leaving the city guard quite poor for it. Varys cleared his throat softly. Might I suggest looking to greybeards, my lords? Men who fought and besieged keeps in the stepstones, mayhaps? Christopher considered the suggestion. Veterans from the Ninepenny War were likely their best option. Seeking help from the Tyrells would take too long. No, veterans would be the most efficient choice. A fine suggestion, Varys, Christopher eventually said before turning to Adam. Have your men inform the heralds and procure a siege engineer. There must be at least a handful in this city of 500,000. My lord, Adam said with a nod. Christopher then turned to the master of ships. Would that work for you? Lord Lucerys stared at him silently for a moment. With some elevated wooden structures to allow them to shoot over the walls, then I suppose so. Christopher clapped his hands together. Wonderful. I will leave it in your capable hands. I am sure the treasury can handle it, isn't that right, Maester Allard? He turned to the grey-cloaked man sitting at his side. The chains around the middle-aged man's neck clinked as he nodded. They will survive, my Lord Hand. I have catalogued, documented, and inquired into the crown's coffers at your behest. Maester Allard began as he rose to his feet, addressing the whole council. The coffers are bleeding, but it is a steady stream, mainly due to the recruitment and increased upkeep of the gold cloaks. What I discovered is more relevant for the absent master of coin, but I will briefly summarize it as best I can. Maester Allard grabbed a small pile of documents and sifted through them. Loans are at a low since King Aerys, in his later years, was in no condition to call for loans, never mind that his numerous projects never left the theoretical stage. His only significant expense beyond the usual crown expenditures were his donations and commissions to the Alchemists' Guild, payments that I have halted. The man raised an eyebrow toward Christopher. Presuming I haven't overstepped? Not at all, Christopher replied with a smile. I granted you leave to peruse the crown's finances, and it is only admirable that you help mitigate small-minded wastes of coin like that. Continue. It was nice to have a competent and learned man to rely on. Robin and Adam were loyal to a fault, but they were still only two, and it did not hurt to gain more. Maester Allard nodded, his eyes flicking to the documents again. There is not much more to say. The increased numbers of gold cloaks are only feasible for a finite time, but with the crown quite ready to loan coin, it may hold for years at present levels. Hopefully, for the treasury's sake, the war ends in the not-too-distant future. I believe we all hope so, Maester. Regardless, it sounds like in the present circumstances the crown is holding relatively well, and the gold cloak's ranks will be reduced when the city's defense can bear it, Christopher explained. Looking around, he saw Adam, Robin, and Maester Allard nod with satisfaction. If there was nothing else. A small matter, my Lord Hand, pardon the interruption, Varys suddenly said. Christopher nodded. Let us hear it then. It will be quick. I only recently heard my birds sing of an Ironborn attack upon the Shield Islands in the Reach. It was thankfully ineffectual and does not seem to have done much, but I thought you would want to know that the Greyjoys have seemingly chosen a side, Varys informed them. Christopher shared a look with Lord Velaryon, who had an ugly grimace upon his face. If there was one thing almost every Westerosi sailor hated, it was the Ironborn. I see. Maester Allard, send a letter to Prince Doran informing him in turn of the Ironborn attack and ask that he keep an eye out on the stepstones for any passing Ironborn who may wish to challenge the royal fleet's supremacy in the Narrow Sea. Maester Allard bowed slightly. At once, my Lord Hand. Good. Sir Adam will lead the councils in my absence. He will also take on Sir Robin's duties in his absence. Lord Velaryon will manage the siege works and the city's defense, working in conjunction with him. Maester Allard, you will continue to handle the responsibilities of the Master of Coin and prepare a more detailed summary for Lord Tyrell's arrival, Christopher outlined quickly. This has been a productive meeting. I bid you all a good day, my lords, he said finally with a nod, feeling his throat burn after the long session. The council members nodded in acknowledgement as they departed, soon leaving Christopher alone in the opulent council room. He had faith that Adam would be able to maintain the status quo until his return, but it would be his first absence from the city since assuming the office of Lord Hand. Even he could not predict how the situation would unfold in his absence. Now, he had to turn his attention to Lord Tyrell and Lord Tarley. One was a bumbling fool, and the other was the only man who had defeated Robert Baratheon in this war, even if Ashford had ended indecisively. Christopher was only the second royalist commander to deliver the rebels anything other than victory, and he hoped to connect with Lord Tarley on this shared distinction. The canopy of the Kingswood nearly blocked out the sun at times as they rode through the dense forest. The 5 guards accompanying Christopher and his cousin spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. There wasn't much else to do during the long ride, Christopher mused. They had been traveling for 2 days since their ship had docked at an unnamed fishing village under House by Water's sway. When Christopher had inquired about a location with deeper water, the locals directed him to a small bay they referred to as Malden's Bay. Named after an ancient Massey lord who had ruled the land during the time of the Storm Kings of House Durrandon, it was said to be a place where a modest fleet might find safe passage. Christopher had briefly visited the area with a few locals who had explained that a small fleet could navigate the bay with relative ease. He thanked the fishermen, tossing them a few golden dragons each and instructing them to assist the royal fleet upon its arrival. They had sworn by both the old and new gods that they would honor his request. Only the gods knew if they would keep their word. Robin suddenly inhaled deeply from the mount beside him. When was the last time we were as free as this, cousin? Christopher was momentarily startled by the unexpected question, but he soon began to reflect. It certainly wasn't since their arrival in King's Landing. Before Harrenhal? Robin suggested after a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. No, it must have been that inn, named after a flower or a plant. Something like that. The Ivy Inn, Christopher confirmed with a nod. It had been a simpler time, before the whirlwind of politics and the burdens of office. He couldn't help but long for the ease of those days, even if they hadn't aligned with his ambitions or his grandsire's expectations. Robin's eyes twinkled mischievously. You remember the name even years later. But it was a bit more personal for you. Christopher rolled his eyes as his cousin waggled his eyebrows. The innkeeper I do remember, a pretty one indeed. She had been quite comely and charming, perhaps someone he could have married in another life. Yet, Robin's teasing was a bit poor. Had he grown rusty? Jealousy doesn't look good on you, cousin, Christopher retorted with a teasing grin. It wasn't surprising to learn that the whores in King's Landing were your first since we left Sow's Horn. Robin stared at him blankly for a moment before bursting into laughter. Christopher caught the curious glances of the guards out of the corner of his eye. The hand of the king, Sir Christopher Mudd. Jesting? Robin laughed even harder, and Christopher's smile widened in response. It's good to know there's still something of your old self beneath the lordly mask, Robin said, his tone sobering slightly. Christopher's smile faltered as he reflected on the cost of his current life. He often wondered how much he was willing to sacrifice for the sake of nobility, his time, simple love, a humble life, his friendships, and family. He no longer knew where he would draw the line. Though perhaps it's the fresh air that brings it out, Robin added with a light jest after a moment of silence. No, I think I, and Adam should meet as we used to. Who knows what might happen in war? It's been too long. Christopher agreed. If they could still share moments like this, he was determined to make it happen. Indeed, it has certainly been too long, Robin nodded, and the silence between them was now more comfortable. However, his cousin's grin returned, and Christopher braced himself for the next jest. Circling back to your former flame, Think there are any brown-haired children toddling about? Christopher was caught off guard by the question. He had not expected such a question and struggled to recall the finer details of the past. Surely he hadn't been so careless? I doubt it strongly, Christopher answered after a moment, and Robin raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Oh? Played a game of Civis or two, did you? Robin teased. Of course not, but truly, I don't remember the specifics of what precautions we took, Christopher admitted. Robin scrutinized him for a moment. A bit unlike you to forget, considering you're not exactly Robert Baratheon, fathering your own army. Still, you aren't an innocent maiden either, if I recall our days at Sow's Horn correctly. Christopher didn't care for the direction of the conversation and seized the opportunity to redirect it. How does the capital view Robert Baratheon these days? Robin regarded him for a moment, as if reluctant to let the conversation shift, but then seemed to relent. There are whispers of the demon of the trident in every brothel, inn, and tavern. He's painted both as a literal demon from the seven hells and as a righteous warrior king fighting against King Aerys' tyranny. The latter view has waned since the Mad King's death and Lord Lannister's arrival. King's Landing has been a Targaryen stronghold almost constantly since its founding by Aegon, when it was still called Eganfort, Robin continued, as they navigated the winding path through the dense forest. Food is still plentiful, thanks to our control over the naval trade routes, which keeps the majority of the small folk relatively content. There hasn't been a Baratheon in King's Landing since Lord Steffan, Robert's father, which leaves him largely unknown to those who only hear rumors. Robin turned back to face Christopher. This makes the Targaryens and, by extension, you, the obvious side to support. Christopher nodded in acknowledgement as his cousin finished. This is good for both the cause and myself. Thank you, Robin, he said, with an air of finality. They both decided to let silence prevail for the moment. Not long after, the dense forest gave way to a clearing, revealing the keep and village of Chittering Brook. The Motte and Bailey keep stood centrally, with the village and small fields spreading out around it. Christopher addressed his party. We shall stay at the inn to both inquire about the Reachman army and to remain undetected. His men nodded. Take Robin's and my horses to the stables while we head to the inn separately. We shouldn't all arrive at the same time. Very well, my lord, one of the guards, Mern if he wasn't mistaken, replied. Robin and Christopher dismounted, handing the reins to two of the guards. With a wave of their hands, they parted ways. The two then began walking towards the inn, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth and scattered leaves. As they approached the inn, Christopher noted the simple yet welcoming establishment. The sign hanging above the door depicted a red stream. Once inside, they were greeted by a servant girl who sidled up to their table as they sat down. Welcome to the Bloody Brook, my lords, she said, looking at them intently. What would you like? She glanced toward Robin, but Christopher cleared his throat and tapped in front of an empty chair at their table. There was a middling number of patrons in the establishment, and a few threw curious looks in their direction, attention Christopher wasn't interested in. The girl looked briefly around before sitting down in the chair. Christopher slipped a gold dragon from his coin purse and palmed it, letting the girl notice it before speaking. I would like to know if you knew of any armies in the area? Apart from the Lannisters, of course, he asked in a soft voice. The girl's gaze rose from the golden coin in his hand to his eyes. She had a strange expression upon her face. There is talk of an army at Bronzegate flying rose banners, my lord. Christopher shared a significant look with Robin. His cousin's brown eyes revealed little as they briefly met his before scanning the room. I see. What is your name? Christopher asked after a moment. The brunette girl looked a little hesitant before answering. It is Maya, my lord, the young wench replied after a moment. Christopher nodded to her with a charming smile. Thank you, Maya. Could you bring my friend and me an ale each? He said, flicking the gold coin into her lap. Maya's eyes flickered down to her lap for a moment before pocketing the coin. You were a lot more polite than the last two. Christopher barely heard the comment, but his head snapped to her in a heartbeat. Other two? The girl's eyes widened dramatically. Yes, milord, 2 older men in red, clad like soldiers. They just left before you two arrived. The girl shook her head. Cursed out my friend Lily and everything. Christopher's heart pounded. He and Robin jumped to their feet almost simultaneously, startling the serving wench. Would these men be headed for the stables? Maya nodded silently. Christopher didn't waste another second. He sprinted out of the building, the cooling evening breeze stark against his heated skin. He heard Robin following closely behind as he bolted in the direction of the stables where their guards had taken the horses. It had been quite some time since he had been in such a rush, but he would not allow Lannister scouts to report on the Tyrrell's approach. If the serving girl spoke true, then this was the first time the scouts had gathered this information, making him hopeful these were the only ones aware. A warm glow emanated from a crack in the stable door, and Christopher dragged it open. Inside, his guards looked up in surprise. "Milord," one began before Christopher interrupted. "Has anyone been here? Did anyone leave with their horses just now?" Christopher demanded, as Robin joined him at his side. The guards exchanged glances before the first man shook his head. "Not that we saw, milord. We arrived some time ago and had a little trouble stabling the horses, but there was no one else in the meantime," the man explained. Christopher was about to respond when a noise came from one of the stalls. All the men turned toward the sound, and Christopher was the first to draw his sword. "Step out, whoever you are," he ordered, hearing his guards and Robin follow suit by drawing their weapons. There was no reply. Christopher gestured to one of the guards to open the stall door. No horse was housed on that side of the stables, meaning the source of the sound was either a coincidence or someone hiding. The door creaked open, and just as Christopher was about to repeat his order, 2 dark figures emerged, attempting to flee. They underestimated Christopher's numbers, as the opening was completely surrounded. One figure faltered, stopping in a small cloud of dust, while the other attempted to slip past the blockade. He was swiftly punished for his daring, a castle-forged blade slamming into his face, rendering him unconscious as he hit the dirt. Christopher's gaze returned to the man who had not tried to run. "You chose wisely. Now, let my men restrain you, and then we will have a small talk." In the faint light of the stable, Christopher could see the man's red garb and desperate, flickering eyes searching for an escape while glancing at his unconscious companion. Within 5 minutes, the 2 Lannister scouts were tied up to 2 chairs near the entrance. Christopher stood in front of them, arms crossed and gaze hard. "You are Lannister scouts," Christopher stated matter-of-factly, not wanting to start with any pretense. "Now start talking, or else the blade to your head will be a lot less angled." The second scout was still unconscious, leaving the sandy blonde man, who looked about 10 name days older than Christopher and Robin, as the only one capable of answering. His pale green eyes showed his true fear and anxiety. The man didn't answer, still seemingly searching for an escape. Christopher turned to one of his guards. "Jeremy, fetch a block. It seems we will have to see how much love this man holds for his companion." Jeremy bowed before departing quickly. Christopher turned back, seeing the man's eyes widen. "Will you still not answer? I assure you this is no bluff. Your friend there still has all his limbs, for now. You can prevent it." The scout looked petrified but remained resistant as Jeremy returned with a woodcutter's block. Christopher grabbed it and personally placed the unconscious scout's arm upon it. Looking back, he gestured toward the stabled horses. "Search their horses for a blade of some kind. I don't wish to blunt mine." As Jeremy and Mern walked to the booths to search for a blade, Christopher turned back to the conscious Lannister scout. "You only need to answer one question. Are you the first to learn this information, or has it already been passed on?" The scout's eyes welled with tears, but he remained silent. Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Does an old lord miles away frighten you so much when I am here with your life in my hands?" He sighed, trying to soften his tone slightly. "It really doesn't need to be difficult. I do not want to do this either, but your resistance forces my hand, You see, Christopher tested the balance of the short bastard sword handed to him by the guards, then lined it up on the lower arm that lay across the wooden block. The blade drew a slight amount of blood as he let it rest there for a moment. He raised the blade with both hands on the handle. No. The scout screamed in desperation. Yes, we are the only ones who know, I swear upon me ma and pa. Christopher held the blade completely still, though still ominously over the arm. Yes, and? Christopher asked. The scout blinked in pure confusion. And? You promised that you only wanted one answer to spare his arm, the Vesterlander replied in a betrayed tone of voice. Christopher paused dramatically for a moment. I did, didn't I? He said before turning to face the sandy blonde scout. That was for his limbs, if I recall correctly. It was a play on words, in bad faith. The scout's eyes widened in terror as he understood Christopher's meaning. You have already betrayed your lord. If he found out, you would be hanged for treason. What is a couple more treasons for your life? Christopher asked softly. Why, you are a monster. Have you no empathy? The scout stated with hate in his eyes. Christopher almost rolled his eyes. So is, and neither has, your Lord Lannister. He looked at the man almost bored. Do you not understand that you are at my mercy? Who even are you? Some kind of bandits? The man asked, his eyes flickering to the gathered guards and Robin. Christopher almost laughed. Have you not discerned my identity yet? I am King Aegon Targaryen's Hand of the King, and I assure you, as Lord Tywin learned, it is no empty title. The scout seemed completely in shock, shaking his head slowly. Just tell me how often you scouts are sent here to Chittering Brook and further, and then my questions are done. We were the first. We don't usually pass the crossroads of the Roserode, the man said absent-mindedly. As Christopher was about to reply, the man continued, you intend to meet the Reachers and ambush us. You must know you will never outsmart Lord Tywin again. He has never lost a war. The man shouted with some mad glee, though it quickly disappeared at Christopher's reaction. Christopher sighed, closing his eyes. Hasn't fought all too many wars either, he countered, shaking his head. You were so close, you know. I had half a mind to let you live. Wah, the scout managed to say before Christopher slammed the pommel of the blade into his face, sending the man into unconsciousness alongside his companion. Turning to his guards, Christopher grimaced slightly. Place them in the booths of their horses and make it look like the mounts did it, he ordered, gesturing vaguely to his head. Make sure to close the booths and have it look like an accident. His loyal guards released the two scouts from their bindings, hefting them on their shoulders and making for the booths. Robin joined him by the now empty chairs and bindings. We arrive at the Wendwater Bridge on the morn, I believe, Robin stated simply. Christopher could hear the graphic sounds of the guards staging the scene. Good. We will retire for the night at the inn when this is done, he replied. It was not pretty. Christopher felt a slight chill as he reflected on how far he had departed from his old, simpler self, a mere man-at-arms among dozens in a small Crownlander keep. Robin had been right, there was only a small part of his old self left, and it felt like it was becoming ever smaller. Would his grandsire approve? Christopher knew he could not afford to be as innocent as a saint in this quest, but had his grandsire foreseen this? It mattered little now, he supposed. His grandsire would be lucky to still be alive, let alone able to witness his achievements. The dead would not answer his questions, his parents' silence was evidence enough of that. Christopher only hoped his grandsire had learned of his ascension to Hand of the King before he passed. It would show him that he had made progress toward their shared dream. Lord Randall Tarley tapped the pommel of Heartsbane lightly, letting none of his irritation show on his weathered face. The sounds of the Wendwater flowing under the bridge and the horses behind were the only things he could hear as he and his men stood in absolute silence, waiting. They had brought a single Tyrell banner-bearer while the rest showed the Red Huntsman. Randall could not put into words his feelings about Lord Mace's petty stunt of not meeting personally. The principle of a common knight summoning a great lord, never mind the hundreds of miles he had marched and ridden from Storm's End to get here, was utterly nonsensical. It left Randall as the lone lord to greet the knight who had somehow risen to hand of the king and Lord Regent. If not for the Battle of the Gate, Randall would have thought the man a mummer with a bad sense of humour. Now, however, there was eager talk about the mysterious man. Randall had met him once at Harrenhal and thought him a typical young knight, if gifted with a sword and duels. Now, that young man had done something Randall could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. The Tali Lord had been preparing for how to survive the war as best one could, considering the war lost. Their Reach army was large, the largest after the Trident, but he had had no faith Lord Mace would do anything after 2 years of nothing. He had almost been proven right when his Tyrell liege threw the first missive from this hand of the king into a hearth after a long chuckle about it. The tone had changed at the second one, however, and they had been on the march soon after. Randall had been doubtful himself but was so thankful they were actually doing something that he went to drill the men and prepare them for battles to come. There were thousands of young men in the army now slothful and lazy after 2 years of siege, in no shape to fight. He changed this mentality when they passed the parchments, and by the time they reached Bronzegate, these men were as ready as they could be without actual fighting experience. Randall had gained a lot of influence after Ashford. While he saw it as an indecisive clash and irrelevant in the long run, Mace Tyrell painted it as a grand military victory. The lords and men then believed it to be a victory in turn, but also knew who to thank for it. He was both thankful and frustrated with his countrymen's attitudes. They participated in a tourney or two and thought themselves veterans of war. His vanguard at Ashford were veterans, the host that arrived under Lord Tyrell were simply veterans of marching and feasting. "My lord, riders in the distance," one of his men said. Around a bend came 2 riders bearing banners, soon followed by 5 more without. The banner on the right was something Randall had seen dozens of times through his life. He did not think he could ever forget the red dragon upon black. The golden crown detailed with emeralds upon brown, however, was something he had only seen once, worn on a surcoat by the rider in the middle of the party. "Indeed there are," he replied, straightening his back and letting his hand rest still on the pommel of his ancestral Valyrian steel sword, sheathed in its jeweled scabbard and leaning against his leg. Usually, he would have it slung across his back, but it would be his own show of strength in comparison to Lord Mace's small-minded power play. The riders were soon at the bridge, and the man Randall knew to be Sir Christopher Mudd halted his companions and rode a few steps past. "Lord Randall Tarley, a pleasure to meet again. I am missing the presence of your liege Lord Mace Tyrell?" the man shouted, looking a little hesitant. Alert was maybe the better word, Randall thought. He picked up the scabbard holding Heartsbane before bowing. "And to you as well, Lord Hand. I am afraid Lord Mace is in an encampment a half-hour behind." Randall could see the young Hand raise an eyebrow. "I see. Suppose I don't want to keep the vanquisher of the demon waiting then." There were some small chuckles from his men while he simply stared at the knight. "Indeed, let us ride," Randall commented after a moment, attaching Heartsbane to his mount saddle before swinging up on it. He then turned to some of his men. "You 10 will stay here and guard the bridge. I defer to you on how to handle it." His men did not reply as the rest of his entourage mounted their horses. They were soon joined by Christopher and his men, with the Hand riding up alongside him. "You have accomplished much and more since I last saw you, Lord Hand," he started. "A most impressive list, I must say, from someone who has only heard rumors and less." Christopher and Randall rode at the head of the column, leaving the rest of their entourage to follow. Randall noticed a thinner rider clad more like a knight, his horse 2 steps behind Christopher's. The younger man glanced at him with a touch of humor in his green-blue eyes. "Less, my lord?" Christopher echoed, a hint of amusement in his tone. Randall maintained his serious expression, even as he saw the subtle grin on Christopher's face. "Indeed, Lord Hand. The soldiery are prone to the queerest japes and stories in the absence of facts." Christopher nodded, his grin widening slightly. "I suppose they are. Any specific stories that caught your ear? Randall regarded him thoughtfully. Everything from dragons to sorcery, snarks and grumpkins. All drivel, really. What I am more interested in are the facts. Randall listened intently as Christopher recounted his rise from guardsman under the patronage of a prince to becoming Hand of the King and detailing his most recent battle. Randall remained silent throughout, asking only brief clarifying questions. He recognized that Christopher's account, while likely edited for brevity, was nonetheless a compelling narrative, one that could easily have been the stuff of legend. Now, it seemed, it was becoming a significant chapter in history. "How is it you've come by all this knowledge?" Randall asked, his curiosity piqued. "I refuse to believe it's solely down to luck." Christopher regarded him thoughtfully. "Lords may forget the lessons of the past, but books do not. It's remarkable how many pitfalls can be avoided by studying history." A faint chuckle almost escaped Randall's lips at this simple yet intriguing answer. "Correct me if I'm wrong, Lord Hand, but weren't you born common? How did you come by such access to these books?" Christopher smirked. "True, I was not born in a keep or castle. However, my grandsire, who raised me, was deeply interested in the histories of our house and beyond. Additionally, I spent a considerable amount of time in the service of Sir Roger Hogg at his keep, where I had access to his extensive martial library." "It is clear you are a resourceful man in all facets," Randall stated, noting the humility in Christopher's nod, though he doubted its authenticity. "I thank you for the kind words, my lord," Christopher replied. Randall shook his head. "You have only delayed the seemingly inevitable for now." The Tali Lord was now deadly serious. King Daeron I won every battle and even the war but could not win the peace. He had Christopher's full attention now. "You would not be the first in history, as you say. The higher you rise in arrogance, the harder the fall." Christopher seemed slightly irritated by his words. "Have I not proven myself? Lord Tywin lays bloodied, Lord Eddard captured, and Robert Baratheon chasing his own tail," he exclaimed, clearly touched by Randall's pointed remarks. Randall remained composed, his expression impassive. "You have proven yourself a commander capable of victory and a leader of men. But will you quit while ahead or dare to keep office with enemies both angry and knowledgeable of your abilities? These are the questions you need to ask yourself," Randall replied sagely. "Be mad at my words all you want, it will only prove them true. I wish for us to win, of course, but that cannot happen if we are led by a child." Christopher's anger flickered for a moment longer before he settled for a stiff nod. "Action before words, Lord Tarley, action before words." Randall never got to reply as they entered the sea of tents strewn about the dense forest by the King's Road. Before long, they arrived at an ostentatious green pavilion, its silk walls adorned with golden roses. The guards outside the pavilion straightened at their approach. One of them stepped forward, a young man in Tyrell colours, and bowed. "Lord Tarley, and Lord Hand, welcome. Lord Tyrell awaits you inside." Randall dismounted, handing his reins to a waiting squire. Christopher followed suit silently, the two men soon walking into the green-coloured pavilion. Inside, Lord Mace Tyrell sat at a grand table, a map of the realm spread out before him. He looked up as they entered, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Ah, Lord Hand, I hope the journey was not too uncomfortable?" When Christopher did not immediately reply, the Rose Lord simply shook his head with a knowing look upon his face. "Welcome, welcome regardless. Could I interest you in something off the cheese tray?" "Ever had, they are simply to die for," the portly man clad in ill-fitting if rich-looking armor said as Randall walked to his side. Christopher glanced at him briefly before taking a seat and nodding. "I have had the pleasure, but I suppose something while we discuss would not hurt." Mace nodded enthusiastically, signaling a servant to bring the tray. "Excellent, excellent. Now, we have much to discuss, don't we?" Christopher nodded after a moment. "Well, yes, if I may outline my vision and then you can comment on what you think of it," the Lord Hand said, addressing them both. "Sounds like a fine plan, does it not, Lord Randall? Mace Tyrell agreed, his tone condescending. Randall simply nodded, waving away the servant who tried offering him the cheeses. It would have been comical if Randall had not been so provoked by the Lord Paramount's attitude toward war, thinking it a great series of feasts and then a tourney at the end. It was infuriating to see the waste of resources, but there was little he could do. Well, I intend to ferry as many of your men across the bay to Stokeworth with the Royal Fleet, which is 150 vessels strong currently. The Master of Ships, Lord Velaryon, reckons it would be possible to have 20,000 men or so over in a reasonable amount of time, Christopher explained. Oh ho ho, and why would I split my forces in half? The King's Road is perfectly fine for marching, I assure you, Lord Mace replied with a rich chuckle. Randall grimaced. He intends for us to accost Robert Baratheon on his march south, not to flank Lannister. He decided to leave out anything else he wished to add. Lord Mace blinked, seeming to try to make sense of the plan in his head. A most interesting proposition, Lord Hand, the portly lord eventually commented. Yes, you will land in Stokeworth lands and then march to ambush Robert Baratheon and his host as they head south. I will leave the orchestration of the details to you. Lord Mace was silent now, so Randall decided to take the initiative. Very well, but what of the other half? Will you alert Lord Tywin of their presence to keep his gaze south, or? He suggested. It might be prudent, though it could just as easily send the Lion to flight either to the north or west. No, it may spook Lord Lannister, and I wish for him to dip his banners then and there. No, instead you will have the remaining host here camped either here or by the Chittering Brook, ready to march with a slight delay to allow for the ferrying of the first half. Christopher took a brief breath, locking eyes with Randall. Then, on the night before or of your ambush of Robert, I will sally forth from the city, sabotaging his camp, supplies, and siege works, leaving them both distracted and in no condition to potentially reinforce or attack your men. Randall's eyebrows rose at the comprehensive plan. It seemed quite feasible, though it required some luck to make it work. It still left them with some leeway to maneuver. Not a bad plan at all, Lord Hand. I am sure we can polish the rough edges, but it sounds both daring and possible enough to work. I believe it would be most prudent to leave you in charge of this force, Lord Tarley, and Lord Mace in charge of the remaining, Christopher began, but Mace Tyrell cut him off abruptly. No. No, as Lord of the Reach and Warden of the South, I will lead this daring attack with Lord Randall here by my side, Mace exclaimed, seemingly trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Randall was well aware of Tyrell's fear that any grand victory and influence for his vassals could challenge his seat at Highgarden. Randall understood the delicate balance of power within the Reach. Despite Mace's weaknesses, a divided Reach was a vulnerable one, a lesson learned painfully during the Blackfire rebellions and Peak Uprising. The other heirs of House Gardner would not accept House Tarley, especially not under a dragonless king and royal family. Very well, my lord, Randall replied to his liege, speaking for Christopher. If you leave with me, might I suggest your good brothers, Sirs Baelor and Garth, lead the remaining force? Lord Mace looked confused for a moment before recognition dawned. Ah yes, of course. My wife's family has proven loyal and worthy of this honor indeed, a fine suggestion. Christopher seemed a bit puzzled during this exchange but then hesitantly smiled. It sounds like we have figured out a plan. Randall nodded, and Lord Mace smiled, once more at ease. Indeed, I believe we have covered what was needed. Now, how about you join me for a luncheon, my Lord Hand? You mentioned a betrothal between my Marjorie and the king. Perhaps we could discuss it over the meal? Lord Mace inquired with a hungry look on his face. I suppose we could, Christopher agreed as the two rose to their feet. Until we meet again, Lord Tarley, the Hand said as he departed with Lord Mace, the portly man now entirely focused on the betrothal. Randall waved before sighing as they left the pavilion, guards in tow. Only time would tell how this all would develop. He liked the plan but was well aware how even the most carefully laid schemes could fail for the smallest of reasons. The war was undoubtedly entering a new phase. Whether this would be the final chapter, Randall could not say, but he knew that this phase would be decisive. The question remained, for which side?